Just a warning. This episode contains topics that may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hey everybody, I'm Zoe.
And I'm Chandi.
And this is Bound by the Cloak.
Today, we're taking you to North Carolina's Outer Banks, where the ocean breeze carries both beauty and unease. The crash of the waves, the sand between your toes, and the isolation of the coastline form the backdrop of a crime that has haunted this community for decades. Our guest is journalist and author John Railey, whose new book, The Carolinian Murder at Nags Head, the Janet Siclari Story, pieces together a story of violence, loss, and unanswered questions.
John knows this place well. He spent much of his life on the Outer Banks, served as editorial page editor of the Winston-Salem Journal, and has written several best-selling books on the region's mysteries and history. With John, we explore what drew him to tell Janet Siclari's story, the path of his investigation, and why this crime still echoes in Nags Head today.
John, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you.
Could you start by sharing a bit about your background as a writer and a journalist?
So I majored in English at UNC Chapel Hill, and I was brought up, my father was a criminal defense lawyer, so I was kind of got that from that side. And when I got out with my English degree, I worked my way to newspapers and rose up through there and was the editorial page editor for the Winston-Salem paper. Newspapers is not a question of if you're going to get whacked, but when. And so that happened in 2018. And then I found my way into kind of a dual thing. I was investigating, mitigating factors in death penalty cases for the state. And I started writing true crime books. And I'd done a lot of crime reporting in my career, including being assigned to the cops and courts beat and being a special projects reporter and writing editorials for criminal justice reform. So I had a pretty good knowledge of it. And my work investigating mitigating factors keeps it real and keeps me in the street. You don't do that kind of work unless you've charged out by a pit bull. You get out there.
And you kind of have an interest in matters that involve social justice. I guess, how did that come about?
Both my parents were from Quaker backgrounds, so that was really strong. And they had always taught me for social justice, for criminal justice, political justice, all kinds. That was ingrained into me.
So you didn't ever want to become a lawyer?
No. In fact, at one point, I even took an aptitude test, and it quickly said you can do it, but you're not really analytical side, and you would be very bored by it because it's not all murder cases. So I get to do the most fun things about law, a lot of investigating and a lot of analysis without having to do deeds and wills and all of that stuff. And a lot more writing, of course.
From what you've mentioned, you've spent most of your life in the Outer Banks in North Carolina. So how has the connection to this place really shaped your interest in telling true crime stories from this region?
I did a lot of my growing up on the Outer Banks, and it's really shaped me, and it's just beautiful, and it has so many stories. And so that's where it shaped me. In fact, I try to do all my books now there because that's all inspiring, AWE inspiring and ALL inspiring all the time. And I go to my neighborhood bar there, Sam and Omi's, and I'm just picking up stories. Boom, boom, boom. Somebody beside me will just start telling this story. Oh, my God. So, it's really good.
You have this new book that came out earlier this year. So your new book, The Carolinian Murder at Nags Head. So do you want to just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, this was so personal for me. Like, there's the cover where you can see this. There's a little brown spot, the last cottage you can see. So that's our old oceanfront cottage, and from there you could see the third floor oceanfront room where Janet spent her last night, just as she could have looked out that window and seen our cottage. And heretofore on that stretch of beach, we just had no crime. And what happened to Janet, she'd been out to a bar and she went out to have one last cigarette, and this horrible thing happened. And I've done that so many times in my life to, you go out and then you go out to look at the ocean. Nothing like that had ever happened to me, and it was a death of innocence for us all.
For those that don't know, can you describe what exactly is the Outer Banks? Where is Nags Head in relation to Southern Shores and other places in the area?
So the Outer Banks, it's often misdescribed as islands. It does contain the island of Hatteras, the island of Ocracoke, and the island of Manio. But basically the part that comes out of Virginia, it's basically a long peninsula that's connected offshore to a bunch of barrier reefs. It is the Outer Banks because they're the outer band out there, the banks against the ocean, and so dramatic and so pretty. I was born in 1961, and when I started going there, we didn't even have phones in cottages. But to go back, so it starts at the Virginia line. If you just traveled by the beach from the North Carolina line to Virginia Beach and Sandbridge, you'd hit first. It'd only be like maybe 45 minutes, where in a car on the highway, it's going to be 2 hours. And some people do have those special permits. And the Outer Banks is so beautiful because it's got North Carolina 12, which basically parallels the ocean all the way from Corolla to Ocracoke. And it's the closest thing North Carolina has to one of those California oceanfront highways. And you can't see the ocean the whole ways, but you can peek at it. And as you go down the North Carolina coast after Ocracoke, the rest of the North Carolina coast is only accessible. The closest thing to an ocean highway is Highway 17, which is far away from the beach towns. You have to zigzag in and out. So that's why one reason Outer Banks is so beautiful. And it goes from Corolla is the last town with pavement goes, and then you have Duck, then you have Southern Shores, where Janet had been staying a week before her death, and this was in August 1993. And then from Duck, it goes on up into Kitty Hawk, Southern Shores, and Nags Head. And she was killed in Nags Head. Right across the Roanoke Sound from Nags Head is the county seat Manio and on Roanoke Island. And that's where her killer was tried.
Thanks for describing that. As someone, as Zoe said, as some people who don't know Nags Head, that part of the world, one of those someone is me.
Yes, sure. This happened in 1993. It's kind of a dividing point because this is a point where development was just starting to take over. And still, as compared to a lot of northern beaches, on the northern Outer Banks, once you get away from Southern Shores, Duck has a very obnoxious set of legalities going on down there where they basically restricted all ocean access, which we just stood up for right and left on the Outer Banks. And there have been lawsuits about it. Once you get south of Duck, all the way to Ocracoke, we've got a public access, at least in the main towns of the northern Outer Banks. There's a public access about every quarter mile, which is a wonderful privilege that it's a right, but we don't have that, in so much of the country. And that's one thing that makes the Outer Banks very special. But it's also its worst enemy because it's getting so popular, and so much of the barren space that we had seen growing up is now McMansions. I saw a cottage the other day in Kildover Hills that's getting $32,000 a week in prime time. And it's got like a movie theater and 32 rooms, but it doesn't look like a lot of fun to me. We're used to our beat up old cottage. So that's the Outer Banks, and that's how it's changing. But it's also just attracts people from all over the world.
It's actually interesting because it's August 28th, 1993 that she died. So that's 32 years in 2 days. The timing is kind of eerie. But can you walk us through what happened on that night at the Carolinian Hotel in Nags Head?
August the 26th. So two days to that, as you noted. Yeah. In August at Nags Head, a lot of years we get a hurricane, like maybe the weekend before Labor Day or a week before Labor Day. But this was one of those ones that was coming in. And Janet and her friends and family had stayed at a cottage in Southern Shores all week. And before she died, in the course of that, they started playing volleyball at the Carolinian, which was kind of a gray lady in this was one of her last glory days. She was built like right after World War II. Beautiful cottage, beautiful hotel. But she had seen her better days, and she was trying to stay hip with things like bikini contests and stuff like that. And they really liked it. And so they stay there. They have a great time. They get to know a Carolinian bartender. And that night, Janet and her two girlfriends go out to a bar nearby the Portico, and they drive their rental car there. And they see the Carolinian bartender who's having a fight with his girlfriend. And then so Janet, her two friends walk on home, and Janet gives the Carolinian bartender a ride home. The next morning, she's found stabbed and raped behind the hotel. She was sharing a room with her brother, and it's so sad. They find her out on the beach, and she was barely 5 feet tall and barely 100 pounds. And she was an ultrasound technician. And when she was stabbed, the stab wound cut her jugular and it cut her voice box. So she couldn't even scream out for help, but the evidence showed that she was alive for several minutes, and she rolled over on her side in a fetal position facing north toward home. And she, as an ultrasound technician, she took the shorts that the killer had taken off of her and held them to her throat.
That really is really, really sad.
Yeah, I mean, they took away, her very voice, but others, as I write, would rise to speak for her.
And you were working on Nags Head or in the area that weekend, right?
Right. Well, what happened was, so I came down. Usually I would follow the murder case. Then I was working in High Point for the High Point newspaper. And usually I was special projects reporter for that paper. And usually I would follow the murder cases in Dare County. But that one, I got distracted because I was covering Hurricane Emily, which turned out not to hit Nags Head hard, but it hit Hatteras in the town of Buxton on Hatteras, the island after Manio, just to our south. And so I went to cover that and just, did follow-ups on that hurricane. And just 2 years ago, somebody was mentioning that case. And I was saying, dang, I forgot all about that. So it was kind of serendipitous. And, then I just started to study it. And I was able to talk to detectives, lawyers that worked on it. And just an amazing case. And this was one where the cops worked hard. And so did the lawyers on both sides of the case worked hard. And we'll have more to talk about that in a little bit. But just amazing. So she was found early on Saturday morning and was probably killed before dawn that Saturday. And that was the weekend before Labor Day. And Hurricane Emily was set to come in the following Tuesday. So it was really a perfect storm in every sense of the word, including that. So they've got this old hotel and it's a mandatory evacuation for that Tuesday. So the poor detectives, they had a weak crime scene anyway. You know how it is at the beach at a popular area. Well, just tons of footprints all around it, most of which probably had nothing to do with Janet and her killer. So they had, this tiny, sorry crime scene. They did have a pair of men's gray high-top tennis shoes. They were beige tennis shoes with gray socks stuffed in them. So that's why some have called it the Cinderella case, because they knew if they could match those shoes to the killer. Meanwhile, they're hustling to beat the storm. They are getting contact information for everyone that was in the hotel, and they start to interview the Carolinian bartender. But at this point we're at now in the story, they just go for that Carolinian bartender, and he's not helping himself whatsoever. He just talks and talks and talks and talks about his girlfriend. And they had a fight that night. And then just in this crazy scene that's true, that he even tells, after Janet lets him out, he lives in a cottage like a quarter mile away. And he borrows a friend's car and drives back to the Carolinian to wait for his girlfriend to get home. And he's sitting in the car, and he grabbed a stick of pepperoni from his house, and he's sitting in the car waiting for her and slicing the pepperoni up with a knife. He tells all this to the police, and it's like one of those situations where you're going, man, you better shut your mouth. Just be quiet. Stop rattling on. But he didn't. He just kept talking, and they were really going at him hard.
Yeah, some people really don't know when they should shut up.
Lawyer up. As I was just watching NYPD Blue today. That was the first one that brought lawyer up into the vernacular in a big way. But the term works.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Janet? She's from New Jersey.
Right. Just a very good person from a good Catholic background from North Arlington, New Jersey, graduated top of her class to become an ultrasound technician, very caring, loving. She was very responsible sexually, not a promiscuous person. And in fact, she had told one friend maybe a year or so before this, they were talking about a friend that had been raped. And Janet just goes, I would never let that happen to me. I would let them kill me first. They would have to kill me first. That was why this was just so off the wall for this to happen to Janet. She'd had 4 boyfriends, including her latest at the time she died, who she'd been off and on. And he had been in a motorcycle gang and had a rough history. So the detectives went up to New Jersey and talked to him. He was alibied out. And, there were some other kind of wild hairs, but the main one they were going for was the Carolinian bartender. At one point, they get a call from the Carolinian that there's a knife that's been found in some laundry there. And the thing was that this laundry, one of those rollers that they put the laundry in, it hadn't been emptied in 3 weeks, which makes you wonder about the Carolinian. Why did they have that laundry sitting around for 3 weeks? But they got that knife. They shared it with the pathologist on it, who was Paige Hudson, who was just this premier North Carolina pathologist. But the best he could say about that knife may or may not have killed her. So they didn't have a murder weapon and didn't have key witnesses. So it's really an uphill battle. At one point, they bring in a guy, John Railey, who works with the FBI, some on a contract basis on tough cases, and really just the top of his field at interviewing. He's written books on that. And he sat down with the bartender, and he comes out, and the local detectives are waiting, and he says, I don't think he's your man. And he said they weren't happy with it. They weren't going to give him a kiss, but to their credit, they said, okay, which is very good, because in a couple of other books I've written about some Dare County cases, they get that tunnel vision where they get their original theory and they can't get off it. These Nags Head, this was, he's retired now, Nags Head Police Detective Tom Gillum and Donnie Varnell, who still works for the SBI. And they were very good about keeping their minds open.
You had mentioned that this was happening at a time when Nags Head was becoming a little bit more commercial. People were coming to this place for tourism. So what was the community's reaction when news came out that Janet had been raped and murdered? And what was your reaction?
Yeah, as with me, at first, it just gets lost in the shuffle with Emily. Like the Coastland Times then came out on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And the first news of the killing happened on a Saturday. So the first time the Coastland Times could report it is in the Tuesdays edition, which the hurricane's coming in that Tuesday night. So on the front page of the paper, below the fold of the paper, where you wouldn't see it as it said in the newsstand, there's just a paragraph talking about New Jersey woman found killed on beach. And that's it. It doesn't even jump to another page, just one paragraph. And of course, the rest of the paper is filled with news of the impending hurricane. So it kind of got lost there. But then as it went on, it always sat in the back of locals' minds and they didn't like it. It never was a thorn in the side of tourism as my previous 2 murder cases, which were in Manteo, were, because Manteo is so much smaller. And Manteo was really in the sense of revitalization and coming back, whereas its tourism had been in a hole. But Nags Head was thriving by then, so it wasn't hurting tourism as bad. So sadly enough, you didn't have a big time official pressure to solve it. So it was just more do what you can over in Nags Head. Where if it had been on Roanoke Island, they'd have had a heavy hammer on it. That's not always the best, because in a couple of cases over there, they've blown them because there was too much official pressure on them.
Obviously Nags Head and Kill Devil Hills and Southern Shores, obviously beach towns. But what's the crime like? Is there a lot of violent crime? Is it just like a really nice kind of sleepy community where not much happens?
In 1993, it was still that way to a certain extent. The crime was starting to pick up. And now, just like so many other areas of the country, fentanyl is just showing up and causing so much related crime. And there have been overdoses from parties and people charged with giving the fentanyl-laced things to people. And so the crime is increasing, sadly enough. But then, you get the occasional murder out of it. But then there was nothing like this. In fact, Janet's case would be the first death penalty case that went to trial in Dare County. And this is, a county founded in 1870. So in more than 100 years, they had not had a death penalty case. They had one case on which I wrote a book on, the Murder in Manteo book, about where they got the wrong guy, but they had been going for the death penalty on him, but they forced him to plead in. So that one did not become a death penalty case.
How did the initial investigation unfold in 1993? And what are the challenges that, the cops, the law enforcement had at that time?
So first off, it's 1993, and the national DNA database and the state DNA database were just infant stages. They did their basic blood test on a lot of people, a lot of suspects they talked to, and were getting nowhere. And then in 1990, so finally they ruled out the Carolinian bartender. So in 1997, in the state DNA database, they get a match with semen found in Janet's body with a gentleman that was being held in a North Carolina prison, Thomas Jabin Berry, who was a commercial fisherman from the nearby town of Englehart, North Carolina. And the wild thing, he was called Jabin, and his name had never surfaced. He wouldn't even be in stir if not for the fact that he was convicted of taking indecent liberties of a minor child. He got out for that. Then he violated his probation, smoking dope, and he was sent back to prison. And by then, this is 1997, everybody entering is required to give blood. So he gave his blood, boom, they get the cold case hit. And SBI calls him from Raleigh, and it's a big deal. And they go talk to Jabin in the jail in southeastern North Carolina. Of course, he denies everything. And, they start working it, as they go on in this first interview, they're starting to make some way. And so then they say, okay, we'll talk to you some more. And they go out, they go talk to one of his ex-lovers or romantic interests, and they show him the picture of the tennis shoes at the crime scene. And she says, yeah, I bought him those shoes. So that's pretty big. And so then they go back and talk to Jabin, and he said, well, if I did it, I don't remember it. I was pretty effed up. And he said, just wiggles and squirms. So, but they had him, and they charge him. And they know even as they do that, they're anticipating what's going to happen, that they've got it nailed down that he had sex with Janet Siclari. What they don't have nailed down is if he killed her. And so that's what they're anticipating is going to happen at trial. And that's exactly what his lawyers did. John Graham and Mike Sanders, they go to town on that. And they're both very good guys. And it must have killed them. But I know from working these death penalty cases, I'm sure they had the talk with Jabin saying, man, this is a stacked deck. And the state never made him an offer. The state just says, we're going for the death penalty. So the state wouldn't even want to plea bargain anyway. But Jabin wouldn't have wanted to. I mean, he was convinced that he could get off. And sure enough, he had those lawyers stand up in court and say, well, yes, we can't argue with the DNA. What they implied was perhaps the sex was consensual. Perhaps he had sex with her, consensual, he leaves, and someone else, maybe the Carolinian bartender, comes along and kills her. So it's right out of Matlock. And by the way, Andy Griffith, at the time he's doing the Matlock show where he's playing the lawyer in Atlanta, he's living in real life right over on Manio. So all this is it was like right out of Matlock, they're rolling the dice and saying, and the Carolinian bartender, he's there for some of our client, you can't prove our client killed her. And then the DAs, who were very good, Robert Trevette and Amber Davis, both judges now, they stood up and said, that is such BS. This is a nice yuppie girl very responsible. She would not have hooked up with this dirtball and just gone and had a quickie with him. This is crazy. And so, and the prosecution, for the lawyers, these are young guys in their 30s. So this is big time. This is Dare County's first death penalty case to go to trial. It's make or break career time. And death penalty trials are like the Olympics. I mean, there's no messing around. You just kill yourself all day long after months of preparation. Then you can't go home and relax because you got to go home and read up on the law and sketch out on your legal pads what you're going to do next. So, and all four lawyers on both sides, just great, hardworking people. And so it goes. And in North Carolina, we have two phases to death penalty trials. There's a guilt or innocence where, you're arguing for guilt or innocence. Then the jury takes that, comes back and acquits or convicts. And then if they convict, you go into the death penalty phase where you're arguing for and against the death penalty. With Jabin, they convicted on first degree. So then the lawyers come back and they're arguing for and against the death penalty. This is January of 1999 in Manio, in this beautiful old courthouse that built in 1904, brick with inside of Shallabag Bay, which feeds into the Roanoke Sound. So just this beautiful setting. And they come back and argue for and against the death penalty. Each side just put on one witness. Each side put on a mother. The prosecution put on Janet's mother. The state put on Jabin Berry's mother. And both sides did great. Janet's mother was wonderful. and heartbreaking. And then when the defense put on Jabin's mother, just showed this guy was not a good person, but they showed how he became the person he was, which is the trick to mitigation, which I've learned so much. It's all narrative and storytelling, which is all about courtroom stuff. But they had one of the best mitigation investigators for the state, Nancy Pagani, who just did her homework, and she was able to establish that this guy was being molested by his father early on and beaten by his father, and just this horrible background. And so you could see who he was. So the jury takes all that they've been told and they get ready to deliberate. Jabin's sitting in his holding cell, and he tells a bailiff, he says, I'm not going to get the death penalty because my mom's friends with a woman that's on the jury. This woman had not disclosed that during trial selection. And sure enough, that woman hung the jury 11-1. So when that happens in North Carolina, if it happened in the guilt or innocence phase, it would have been a mistrial. But in North Carolina, when that happens in the sentencing phase, by law, and they're hopelessly deadlocked, they're not going to move from it, which the judge asks them several times, sends them back. By law in North Carolina, if they're hopelessly deadlocked in sentencing phase, the judge must give the defendant life in prison, which he gave to Jabin. He gave him life for the rape and life for the murder to be served consecutively.
And Jabin had even committed another offense, I believe, with like a neighbor.
Yeah, they brought this all out, and the detectives on it just really well established this case that he'd had 2 serious offenses. He had broken in one woman's house. She was a young adult, and broke through her window, and she's able to talk him out of it and wrestle him out of it. And then before that, he'd been convicted of, this was after that, he was convicted of taking liberties, indecent liberties. This child was 12 years old and basically raped her. It should have been probably a heavier charge. And so that was the one he was convicted of. For some reason, the woman in the earlier break-in thing, she did not press charges. And in the county Jabin was from Hyde, there can be some things like that that happen. As my wife and I were over in Jabin's hometown investigating the case and taking pictures, and a guy was watching us in a truck, and finally he pulls up and says, "What are y'all doing?" And I told him, he said, "I hope you're not for Jabin Berry." And by that point I could say, "No, sir, I'm not." And he showed us around, and he talked about how Jabin just wanted to abuse dogs and this just sorry human being. This guy was telling us, he said, "Yeah, I beat him up so bad once he had to sip his dinner through a straw for a month." And then the guy looked at us and he says, "There ain't no law down here." And basically for Jabin Berry, there wasn't until he got caught for this one.
Yeah, it looks like he had like a clear pattern of just disturbing behavior.
And that's what Amber Davis and Robert Trevette established in case in court. They said, yes, clearly you got your MO here. And to bring it all home, he didn't want to be caught again. He didn't want to go back to prison. So therefore, as Trevette said, he was going to eliminate his witness why he killed Janet so he wouldn't go back to prison. And he's done an interview, he's done an interview for the CNN show Forensic Files. I wrote him and he went, and I reached out to him through his family members too, and he would not talk to me. But this thing he did for Forensic Files several years ago, very cocky, and just says, "Oh, I had sex with a lot of women on the beach," his language. And he said, and it was all consensual, he says. And the thing with Janet, if that happened, that was consensual too, he said. So just horribly cocky. It's just angering to watch that interview.
Yeah, I can't imagine. The Carolinian Hotel is such a well-known and public spot. Do you think that made the investigation harder or easier?
At first, at least they had, a day to catch all the witnesses. At least they did have warning that hurricane was coming and that they had to work fast. So they did that. And yeah, I think John Graham, the defense attorney, had worked at the Carolinian at one point. As John Graham said at the beginning of the trial, the Carolinian is going to figure very importantly in this case. It had just a whole lot of folklore to it. In fact, where the bartender, who was a suspect, where his girlfriend lived, they called that the pond after the Ponderosa of Bonanza, or the dungeon. You had all these colorful beach characters that had long worked there. And so everybody knew about that place. And so that almost cemented, this is the changing of the tide. Here's the old Carolinian that's dying, and here's this beautiful young woman killed behind it. So it was all very easy to point in clear black and white what had been stolen and what they had to do, and they had to exact justice here. even though, and the interesting thing about Jabin Berry, I mean, he's very much one of them. I mean, in one sense, they might have had the prosecution might have had an easier job if it was just somebody from out of town, because locals, depending on the circumstance, can stand up for their own, but not Jabin. He had no friends. And as I said, he was a commercial fisherman, and his little town, the beautiful thing about that area, the Outer Banks, you've got four sounds, like surrounding Roanoke Island. You got the Pamlico, Croatan, Roanoke, and Albemarle. So you've got this beautiful area and an ocean. And just to the north is the Currituck Sound. So just water and wonderful. And Janet loved it. I mean, that's the thing, as Assistant DA Trevette said, he said, in a way, the ocean, the thing she loved, killed her. I mean, she loved it so much, she was going to look at it again. And we that love the ocean, we understand. And, in that sense, when Robert Trevette starts talking about all of that, the locals we can understand what brought her here. We can understand her love of the ocean. It's a universality to it.
She's used to the ocean, essentially, right? She's used to seeing it, being by the water.
In fact, when Janet's mother was testifying, she said, we had just moved down to Florida and bought a place there. And I said, Janet, you're going to have your own room there. You'll always have a room at the beach. And Janet was so excited about that. I mean, the whole thing, they could have gone home. Most of the Outer Banks rentals go Saturday to Saturday or Sunday to Sunday. For some reason, their rental was Friday to Friday. And their flights out were the next day, Sunday. So, they go, Saturday. So they go and stay at the Carolinian that Friday night. And then in making that decision, they said, we can make it to Norfolk. I mean, it's around noon, our flight. And that's so much of a barometer of time right there when you think about it, that this is 1993. You could basically run up to the gate. And as long as you got there before it took off, you were in. All those days before 911 where you got to get there at least an hour beforehand. And so that's why, there's so much terrible luck going on there. And that's why they did that. And then this guy, Jabin, he usually hung out at a beach in Kill Devil Hills, the next town over from Nags Head to the north. And he just happened to be on that Nags Head beach because a relative of his lived between the highways near the Carolinian. So he just shows up on that beach. So terrible. He just shows up at that point. His decision some of the investigators theorized that maybe he took off his shoes because he didn't want to leave a trail. Shoe prints. Well, maybe the shoes were a big hinge in his case. And they were pulling all the stops. At one point, they got a Royal Canadian Mounted Police guy and had him do plaster casts of Jason's feet, the shoe prints, and determined that there's a very good chance he left those, which that eventually on appeal, that is what was called a harmless error, that the appeals court ruled that, that might not be the best evidence, but it was a harmless error. So, I think the defense, though, I was going to say that was one of their main wins they got, but the main win they got was they saved the guy's life, because when you go for a defense like that, basically you're not putting up an alibi defense. You're not saying, I couldn't have done this because I have these witnesses saying I was here. You're just putting up, and of course, he didn't take the stand. You're just putting him up and you're just trying to throw gravel at the state's case. So when you're in that situation, what you can end up with is a jury that's just pissed off at the defendant because they're going, wait a minute, he didn't even put up an alibi defense, and now he wants us to not convict him. So, I think the time spent out of the courtroom, the conviction came relatively quick, and of course the death penalty took longer. And I think maybe some of that was the conviction. Well, no alibi defense, and then but just on the case, just on what his mother had there, what she was saying about his upbringing, I think of course, mainly, and I do think that's what happened. I think his mother's holdout friend saved his life. So Jabin gets all this luck, all this serendipity, and Janet gets nothing. I still walk that beach and I still walk it at night, but in the daytime when I walk it, now McMansions are there where the Carolinian was. And I'm kind of mystic in the sense that I'll be out there paddling on my kayak and I'll say, talk to me, send me a sign, Jan, I'm right here in front. And one day I was doing that and dolphins just came up right beside me, just boom, 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 right beside me. So I was sure, maybe I was on the right track there. And I wanted to be respectful about it and say what a good person she was. And that, this good case of detective work wouldn't be forgotten either.
And how did Janet's family respond to Jabin and the conviction, him receiving life in prison?
I think they were good, and I think it brought them some measure of closure by what I've heard. They told others and the newspapers. I reached out to her brother, Janet's brother, that was with her, who had kind of become the spokesman for the family, and he graciously took my call, and we talked for a few minutes a couple of years ago. But I could tell he just didn't want to go through talking about it again. Very understandable.
You writing this book and talking about this case, I'm sure you've realized this, but what is the larger impact of this case on the Outer Banks community?
If anything, I'm betting that law enforcement probably sent more people to advanced training than they had before. Not that they weren't. That's the way they got Don Rabin to come in and look at this case, that Tom Gillum had a class in Raleigh under Don Rabin and was impressed. So all of that network really does help. I think there's a level of professionalism, even on those small departments like Nags Head and the Dare County Sheriff's Office, that might not have been there back in the day. Dare County has a very good sheriff, Doug Dowdy, who's real good about professional training and keeping his guys up to speed on everything. So I think that might have led to some more training. I think that we don't live in fear on the Outer Banks, that it didn't quite kill all the innocents, but it's made us watch our backs more.
With Jabin and the previous assaults that he had committed, was he paroled or was he, I'm trying to remember, probation, right? He was put on probation.
Right.
After the assault of the 12-year-old girl. But do you think putting him on probation, has there been any more thought given to offenders and letting them out on probation and possibly allowing them to commit, even worse offenses? Because the other two, he didn't have a weapon. This one he did. He had a knife.
Right. So he escalates, yeah. And with the indecent liberty, with the one where he broke in the house, still was never able to establish why that woman didn't press charges. And she did talk to a deputy, I know that. And then on the child, the reason that was indecent liberties, I talked to one law enforcement officer that said it was their understanding the family did not want to go for a trial because they didn't want to put their child through that. And that would be involved with going with a higher charge, would have resulted in a trial. And to that woman's credit, the 12-year-old, so by the time Jabin went to trial, she was maybe 19 and she stood up in court. And so did the one where he broke in her house. Both those women, just unbelievable. And the prosecutors fought to get their testimony into showing that chain of events and that MO.
Because you are part of this community, how was it writing about this book? How was it researching this case? What did you learn?
Oh gosh, just just to watch my back a little better. Like I lost my innocence when I was jumped at a boat landing when I was like 16 by a couple of guys that threatened to kill me, and I was able to get away with no injuries. But after that one, I watched my back, and so that's there. And then with this case, sometimes if you're going to go to a rough place, go with a partner. It's no harm there. But on this case, at one point, I was actually one case before this. That was on Stacey Stanton's case. And I had a event in Manio where I was speaking, and I had been trying to get up with the person of Stacey Stanton that I make the case for who killed her at the end. And one of her relatives that I'd been trying to reach right before this public event I was doing in Manio with the lawyer that worked for the guy wrongly convicted in that case, Chris Muma. So Chris and I were getting ready to have a forum there in Manio, May of 2024. And this guy had been trying to get up with this relative of the guy who I think killed Stacey, and I'd been private messaging him on Facebook. And just a year later, right before this event, right after he'd seen apparently the publicity in the newspaper, he just sends me a palm with what looks like a spent bullet, holding it in the hand. And no words, just that. And so I wasn't going to reply. And I noticed, though, one of those little things came on that he saw that I saw it. And so I had to report it to the community college head that was having this event, because the last thing I wanted to be like a school shooting or something. And I knew about this and didn't tell anybody. And they started to cancel it, but the sheriff checked this guy out and said, I think you're going to be okay. So we went to have the event, and thank God everything was fine. But that's the world we live in, and that's what you have to do. And, on that one, I didn't put any paper on the guy or press a charge or anything, because this stuff we do it's a contact sport. And, I wasn't going to get into that, but I was sure going to let the organizers of that event know.
It's a little scary, but...
Yeah, oh, yeah. So I'm on open Facebook. If anybody wanted to reach me, my site's public. And also my books are available through me or wherever fine books are sold. And of course, I don't want to say the big mail order thing. I'd rather encourage people to go to their independent bookstores if they can. And the independent bookstores can also order them too. And I think we all know the body we're talking about there. Yeah. And so, they're all about true crime murders spanning 1967, 1990, 1993. And they're all women that came from elsewhere. And the flip side of paradise were killed in this place they loved. And so coming from a family of strong women, and that was another thing that was real important to me, to stand up for these women.
Thank you for your time, and honestly, thank you for all the work that you do. It's really important bringing, shedding light on these cases. They're very important cases.
Well, thank y'all for what y'all do. Where are y'all based?
Central New Jersey.
I was just so impressed with how pretty South Jersey was when we went to research the Stacy story, because like I said, my wife grew up there, but gosh, it looks, as y'all know, it looks like North Carolina, so pretty. And in that one, I might have told y'all this, we were riding through these fields and I was listening to an old detective show, and the guy just starts talking about the area where we were in South Jersey, right up to the names of the streets. And at that point, say, thanks, Stacy. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Yeah, it is beautiful down there for sure.
Well, no, yeah, just like Zoe said, thank you so much. Thank you for your work. Thank you. Thank you to John for joining us and sharing this powerful story. His book, The Carolinian Murder at Nags Head, the Janet Siclari Story, is available wherever you get your books, and we'll also have a link to it in the episode's show notes.
Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Bound by the Cloak. As always, you can find us on social media on Threads, X, TikTok, and Instagram. And be sure to subscribe to our podcast wherever you get your podcasts, whether that's Apple, Spotify, we're everywhere. We'll be back again in 2 weeks with a brand new episode. Thanks for listening.
Until next time.